Okay, so today we're going to be looking at the poem by Grace Nichols called Hurricane Hits England. So in terms of overview, the poet's writing about herself being kept awake during the hurricane that hit England in 1987. So that's important context, AO3 as well. It reminds her of the great hurricanes of her childhood in the Caribbean, for example Hattie, and the wind and storm gods that she refers to, Hurricane and Oya and Shango, and that the people of the Caribbean believes caused them. So obviously the most important bit of context is that idea that she grew up in Guyana and she migrated to England. And this is very much about her sense of identity. So it raises a series of questions in the poem. Why have the hurricane gods come to England? What's the meaning of it? And in the end, she welcomes these gods and decides that they've come to let her know that they are here in England as much as they ever were in the Caribbean, and that the earth is the earth wherever you live. And because this very much fits in with her autobiographical story, we can assume that the speaker within the poem is herself, is Grace Nichols. Okay, so let's have a look at the first verse and see the kind of voice that's established initially. So it took a hurricane to bring her closer to the landscape. Half the night she lay awake, the howling ship of the wind, its gathering rage, like some dark ancestral spectre, fearful and reassuring. So it's really interesting in the opening of the poem that she refers to herself in the third person. Okay, so look here. It took a hurricane to bring her closer. Half the night she lay awake. Okay, so what that does is it creates a sense initially of detachment. Okay, that she, maybe Grace Nichols herself, is kind of detached from her own sense of identity. She's distanced from it. She doesn't quite understand who she is, and she's looking from outside of herself, reflecting in. We could read it in a slightly different way. She could be talking about herself, but when she uses this first her here, she could also be talking about England and Guyana, okay, and this idea that England and Guyana are coming together here. We can see how unsettled she is, okay. Half the night she lay awake. So she's really having to, obviously the storm's keeping her awake, but it's not just the storm, it's this thought of what the storm represents. And then she refers to the howling ship of the wind, which is some personification. It's a little bit twisted there. We would expect to talk about the howling wind, but here she makes it the howling ship of the wind. Now, potentially we've got a little bit of AO3 context there as well, because obviously when we think of ships and we think about the Caribbean, we might be thinking of slave ships as well. And there's that part of her identity that's perhaps coming to the forefront here. Now howling is interesting. It's got some onomatopoeia within it, and there's different ways that we howl. We can howl in pain or we can howl in aggression, but in both senses there are negative connotations there, and that's furthered with this idea of its gathering rage. So we've got more negative connotations that are coming with this hurricane. So initially the hurricane set up as something that is fearful, and that's reinforced by this simile, like some dark ancestral spectre. Okay, so there's this idea here. It relates to the storm. The storm's like a spectre that's come to haunt her and keep her up at night. But it's also, the storm is very much symbolic of her kind of personal cultural heritage, which the storm is kind of symbolizing her past, her kind of Guyanan identity coming back to haunt her. Okay. And that's furthered, the complexity of that's furthered with this oxymoron that we get next, that this spectre is both fearful and reassuring. Okay, so at the beginning she's got really mixed feelings about remembering her kind of Guyanan heritage. And then we get this shift to the first person here. So we get this real change. Talk to me, Hurricane. Talk to me, Oya. Talk to me, Shango and Hattie, my sweeping back home cousin. Okay, this here almost becomes now like a soliloquy. Okay, she's talking to herself. Okay, and it's now become very much a personal thing. Okay, When we switch from the third person to the first person and we get this anaphora, the rhythm becomes very much like a kind of insistent drumbeat, which links into the kind of African heritage, which is reinforced with the names of the different kind of African gods here. So we've got the god of hurricane, we've got the African goddess of wind, and of thunder and lightning as well here. So these are all very much references to her kind of Caribbean and thereby African identity. It's also interesting to note, as well as having this anaphora, this kind of drumbeat, it's also in the present tense now, whereas it was in the past. It took, okay, so talk to me, talk to me, talk to me. What that does is it really guides the reader through her feelings in real time. And at this point in time, whereas in the first verse she's feeling quite fearful, at this point in time I think she's feeling very excited as she kind of reconnects with her Caribbean and her African heritage. And we get this personification here. So the first personification was quite kind of negative in some ways, and this one is definitely much more positive. My sweeping back home cousin. Okay, so there's this sense now of the hurricane is coming to symbolize family and home. Okay, let me move this down a little bit. And then in terms of structure, what happens next is that we get a load of interrogatives, okay? And tell me why you visit an English coast. What is the meaning of old tongues reaping havoc in new places? Now, these series of questions are her trying to work her way through her feelings about her uncertainty over her identity. And that, I think, is why they're posed as interrogatives. Some people think it sounds like she's almost kind of praying here, and it's almost like an incantation. And obviously, this first question really sets it up for us, doesn't it? You know, why is this hurricane, which is something that's very much associated with the Caribbean, visiting the English coast? The second interrogative is more interesting because we get this antithesis. Okay, so what is the meaning of old tongues reaping havoc in new places? Now, the old tongues are interesting as well. They're a metaphor for her memories of the past, okay, but they're also reminders, so it's kind of personifying the wind and the memories that they bring, but it's also a reminder of her Caribbean patois. And the Caribbean names of the gods that we've had previously really show her desperation to hear from her past and to reconnect with it. Okay, because tongue is like another way of describing language as well. But it's complicated because it's not just positive connotations that they bring, because they're reaping havoc. So they're bringing this kind of inner turmoil to her, and that complexity is carried on in the next verse. The blinding illumination, even as you short circuit us into further darkness. Now, on one level, obviously, there's been a flash of lightning, and after that lightning, there's further darkness. But this is also metaphorical, okay? So she has this blinding illumination, this realization about her Caribbean past. And blinding illumination is complex in itself, because initially that sounds like, you know, a big realization, but it's also an oxymoron, because if something's blinding, you can't see. So it's not even straightforward in the way that it kind of illuminates her sense of self. And after that initial realization, she circuited into further darkness. Okay, so what that shows us is that the realization brings even greater uncertainty. Okay, let's skip up to the next lot of interrogatives. So we get, what is the meaning of trees falling heavy as whales, their crusted roots, their cratered graves? Here we've got lots of things that really emphasize the chaos and the destruction of the storm. Okay, so we get the idea of trees falling heavy as whales, so really emphasizing that. Similarly, the fact that they're crashing. This pre-modifier, their crusted roots, is really kind of emphasizing the fact that they were quite firmly attached to the ground, and now they've got their cratered graves. So we've got the choice of the noun graves bringing along connotations of death as well. So if we take this to be not just about the trees falling down, but also the uprooting of her sense of self, you know, we can see that she's kind of perhaps rooted herself in her English culture. And as the hurricane comes, those roots become unstable and they become crashing down, and she starts to think of her kind of Guyanan self. And so that really shows us the uncertainty that she's feeling about who she is. And then we get this single line verse, oh, why is my heart unchained? Okay, so what that's doing by being structurally on its own, it's really drawing the reader's attention to that. We get this onomatopoeic O at the beginning, and that's like a sigh sound. What that's doing is that it's showing us her intense feelings, okay, about this really kind of chaotic, unsettling realization about who she is. And then this image of being unchained is interesting because obviously we had the image of the ships earlier on, and obviously the Caribbean, she's going to be thinking about the kind of slave trade that happened in the past. That's going to be a sense of her identity if she's a Guyanan person. So when we think about being unchained, there are perhaps connotations of slavery coming up there, which is something you can talk about from a contextual level. I mean, being unchained in that sense gives us a sense of being liberated, doesn't it? Being freed. But the fact that it comes with this onomatopoeic sigh, oh, why is my heart unchained, suggests that this freeing of herself, the kind of liberating herself from these English roots which she's put down, is initially quite unsettling for her. And then this is where we get a real shift, okay? So tropical oil of the weather. I am aligning myself to you. I am following the movement of your winds. I am riding the mystery of your storm. So whereas before we had interrogatives, what we've got here is a shift to declaratives. And what that shows us is a sense of certainty, okay? She's got this newfound certainty, this newfound stability. So initially she's kind of uprooted, which is the image that she actually comes to use in the last verse, and she doesn't quite know who she is, and then she comes to kind of accept that she can have this duality, I suppose, that she can still have this English identity that's kind of been uprooted by the storm, but she can also follow the movements of the winds. She can be drawn back to her Guyanan identity. It's still a little bit unstable for her because she says, I'm riding the mystery of your storm. So the fact that it's a mystery shows us it's still not clear. She doesn't have complete certainty, but she certainly has kind of a sense of stability and a willingness to kind of accept. That mystery, look at the repetition there, sweet mystery. So that mystery has now been modified to become sweet, which shows us that it's something positive, okay, something that she can enjoy. Come break the frozen lake in me. That suggests that her Guyanan, that's a metaphor again, it suggests that her Guyanan identity had been somehow kind of locked up within her and that she's now liberating that. Shaking the foundations of the very trees within me. So we come back to this metaphor that we had before about the uprooted trees, and she's making it clear that, you know, this has unsettled her deeply. But what we end with, which is really important, is a sense of certainty, okay? Come to let me know that the earth is the earth is the earth. Now, this is actually a reference to a poem written by Gertrude Stein as part of a 1913 poem, Sacred Emily, where she writes that a rose is a rose is a rose is a rose. Now, in that poem, the point that she's making is that things are what they are, okay? So what Grace Nichols is suggesting here by echoing that is a sense of acceptance about how things are, okay? And that, you know, that she has become more comfortable with both her Caribbean past and her English present, and that the hurricane has made her realize the kind of global nature of her identity and of the earth.